And I think now at some point Europeans are going to realize that they can in fact do a lot more on their own, and that maybe the U.S. is not always going to be seen as the indispensable ally that it once was. And I think we're going to regret this.
Hi, I'm Joe Crawford, and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today, I'm joined by former Commanding General of US Army Europe, General Ben Hodges. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you once again for the privilege.
We're recording this interview a few hours before this expected meeting between Trump and Starmer. What do you expect will be said by the US President, but also the UK Prime Minister?
Well, I'm sure probably three things will be part of these discussions. First of all, an important affirmation of the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. This this is typically said, but it's always important to say it, to affirm it, especially now, frankly, because so many Europeans are concerned or uncertain about the Trump administration. And so I think a clear expression affirming this relationship would be important. There's no doubt, secondly, that there will be demands from the United States that UK carry more of the burden of the would make more of a contribution to the collective security of Europe. UK, of course, has always been a strong member of the alliance. There's never been a question about the meeting the 2% sort of expectation. But I think there's a hope probably coming from the administration that UK will be able to do more. So that will no doubt be part of the topic, or one of the topics. And then finally, I think on Ukraine going forward, an expectation that UK will bring along other European countries to pick up more of the burden of support for Ukraine. So I would imagine those are three of the main agenda topics.
And Starmer, he recently said that he was going to up UK defence spending from 2.3 to 2.5% by 2027. There's rumours that potentially Trump will ask for a bigger increase in defence spending. Do you think that Trump will ask for that at this meeting?
Um, I would not be surprised if he did. Um, and I've seen a lot of reporting about the prime minister's plans. Does that increase actually begin in 2 years? Not in the current, this year or the next. So, but I wouldn't pretend to understand the UK's financial, the processes any more than I could understand our own. But I think the sense of urgency is probably one of the things that President Trump would be looking for.
And Starmer, he's warned Trump prior to this meeting that Russia will come again unless the US provides some sort of security guarantees to European soldiers that will potentially be stationed in Ukraine after a ceasefire, if that happens. I mean, from the sounds of things, it seems that Trump is sort of washing his hands of any US involvement in Ukraine. Can you envisage Trump deciding to actually provide some sort of US backstop?
I have to say anything is possible. I mean, that's become, as we all have watched the U.S. president, how he negotiates, how he, talks, almost thinks out loud, if you will. Um, I would say nothing is ever off the table, or that he would never change or walk back something. And so, what I hope is that the prime minister will say, "Look, we European allies are willing to build a force capable of uh, compelling the Russians to live up to whatever sort of ceasefire agreement is made." But and Europe certainly has enough when you add together the military capabilities of almost 30 different countries. So there is enough capability there. What's lacking are some things that the U.S. can provide. The most obvious is this large scale nuclear deterrent, but also large scale logistics, perhaps some intelligence capabilities that I think would be an appropriate backstop, if you will, for any European force that went into Ukraine. And shame on us if we um, pass up that responsibility. If we defer, okay, well, somebody else is going to have to do it, and then expect to be able to reap whatever the benefits are, because Ukraine being successful is a priority for all of us. It should be. It's important for all of us. And President Trump certainly has made this one of his top priorities to get a sustainable peace in this conflict. And so here's a case where the British Prime Minister is offering to lead assembling the force that would be essential to doing this. I think the U.S. obviously has an interest in that force being successful.
And Keir Starmer, he's proposed some sort of plan which would involve a force of around 30,000 British and European troops to be deployed to Ukraine. And he's asking for military support, including air power, from Trump. I mean, we've heard recently from Putin that he says that he does not reject a peaceful solution to its war, but in Ukraine. But we also heard recently a Kremlin spokesperson ruling out territorial concessions to Ukraine and will refuse to negotiate during peace talks over the status of 5 Ukrainian regions it claims to have annexed. If we look at the size of this force that Starmer is proposing and this potential US backstop, I mean, do you think that will still be an effective deterrent to Russia in light of these comments that they've been making?
Let me say this: it's impossible to accurately predict exactly how this is going to play out. So what I'm about to say could be changed tomorrow by a tweet, but I do kind of feel like this is a long process. I mean, months before we get to a final sort of resolution that is sustainable and acceptable to everybody. Most importantly, to Ukraine, that does not lead to a resumption of the conflict. So I see us in three phases. Right now is phase one, which is the preparation phase. And this is the messiest part because there is no structure to it. You've got conversations in Riyadh, conversations in Paris and Brussels. You had President Macron in Washington, now Prime Minister's coming, and tomorrow President Zelensky is coming to D.C. Uh, you had much of the Brussels leadership went to Kiev back on Monday. So all of this, these are talks about how to get to a ceasefire and how to get to negotiations. So these are not the actual negotiations. These are talks about talks in a way. And I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but we, in order to have, in my view, in order to have successful negotiations, there has to be a ceasefire. The Ukrainians, are not going to go into negotiations while you've got Russians that are still killing Ukrainian civilians. And I think, frankly, this will be a test of whether or not the Russians will be responsible negotiating partners. I'm skeptical, but let's assume that we get an agreement over the next 3 months on what a ceasefire actually looks like, and then an agreement on what kind of force will be required. I personally don't know how you can identify the size force needed until you know what the task is. What will this force be required to do? Now, if Prime Minister is talking about UK is prepared to provide 30,000 towards whatever the ultimate size is, that's a different story. But I think we have to get the mission clearly identified. What if I'm the commander of this force? I want to know what is my task, and then I'll tell you what I need to accomplish that task. And of course, that force will have to be something that would deter the Russians from violations. That means it has to have air, land, sea components, drone and counter drone, long range precision strike. It has to be prepared to operate in a very, very competitive electronic warfare space, and they have to have rules of engagement that would allow them to use force to punish Russians when they inevitably violate the ceasefire. But if we get that ceasefire in place and it holds, then we can move to phase three, which are the actual negotiations.
Another sticking point is about peacekeeping forces in Ukraine and Russia rejecting that idea of having European troops acting as peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. I mean, if Russia still stands by that position, and if, for example, Trump rules out putting American troops into Ukraine, for example, I mean, how do you see that potentially hindering this ceasefire negotiation?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, the Russians, of course, they're going to push and go as far as they possibly can, maximalist position. This is their standard way of doing things. But the president, the American president, has made it such a public priority for himself. He wants to get this a deal a security peace deal done. And so the Russians are at risk of overplaying their hand. They actually are in a very weak position militarily. They've lost hundreds of thousands of troops for almost no gain. Any reports or headlines that say the Russians are, yes, they're suffering casualties, but they're still moving forward slowly but surely, that's absolutely not the case. They absolutely are not continuing to gain ground unless you count yards per month. Now, they're also, of course, their economy is in big trouble. The Russians are in a difficult position, and so their best hope is that we are so anxious to get a deal that we force Ukrainians somehow to take a bad deal. And so I think President Trump will be prepared to use the enormous leverage he has over the Russians in terms of sanctions. And thank goodness that the EU has continued its sanctions, regardless of what the U.S. might do. Or he can open up the floodgates of ammunition and weapons to Ukraine. So the Russians, of course, will be aware of all of this. But I'd say one last thing. We are at risk of making ourselves, we, the U.S., irrelevant to this. I mean, there's actually not that much U.S. aid going into Ukraine right now. Um, so at some point, the Ukrainians can say, "Hey, look, we're not obligated to accept whatever the Americans and Russians come up with, just like Europe is not obligated to accept whatever deal there is." Nor should they, because Europe is going to pay the biggest price if Ukraine fails. Millions of Ukrainian refugees will be headed into Central and Western Europe. The reconstruction of Ukraine is going to be delayed, which continues to disrupt food and energy shipments. So I think the U.S. and Russia both should be careful not to assume that whatever they decide is just going to happen.
I want to talk about this minerals deal. We're expecting Zelensky to travel to Washington tomorrow for potentially signing this minerals deal. We're hearing a bit of contention from both sides about if that will actually happen. But what we're seeing so far from these reported drafts of this deal is that there won't be any security guarantees from the US to deter renewed Russian aggression to Ukraine. Zelensky has said that if Ukraine doesn't get these security guarantees, then there won't be a ceasefire. Do you think that this minerals deal will go through? And then, secondly, do you think that Zelensky is right in saying that if Ukraine doesn't get these security guarantees, then there won't be a ceasefire?
I think President Zelensky is setting an example for all European leaders on how to interact with the American president. Um, that you can push back on things that are not good for your country, and that's his first responsibility is to protect the sovereign country of Ukraine and his population. And so um, I think that uh, President Trump's approach is probably what some would call a mercantilist um, approach to diplomacy. That business is business, and it's I don't want to make a judgment about it. I'm just trying to describe what I see happening, and but I guess in a way, if the United States does get access to what potentially, reportedly, is enormous potential, then the U.S. would have an interest in ensuring access to it. So perhaps the Ukrainians are clever in that by offering that, you know, President Trump would not want to lose the access to those minerals. So in an indirect way, that is not a security guarantee, but it would certainly raise American interest in the security of that region. Um, I, I'm stumbling around a little bit because I just don't like it. I can't. I just don't like the way this looks. But I think the Ukrainians are probably being smart in playing hardball here because they have leverage in this as well.
Earlier this week, Putin hinted at a potential minerals deal between the US and Russia. We don't know if that deal will take place. We don't know what that deal would involve. But I've tried to draw some assumptions from this. I mean, firstly, a lot of Ukraine's rare earth reserves appear to be in the Russian controlled territories in the east region of Ukraine. This suggests to me, would Trump potentially accept Russian control over these Ukrainian territories? And then secondly, current US sanctions currently prohibit the US from investing in Russia's rare earths. So would Trump drop sanctions? I mean, do you think that those are fair assumptions for me to draw?
I think anything that gives Russia, that rewards Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine, its violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, allows it to profit from what it's done, is wrong. I mean, maybe in the 18th or 19th century, this would have been an acceptable sort of, big spheres of influence kind of approach. But I think in this century, with all that's we've worked hard to accomplish over the last 80 years since the end of the war, this respect for sovereignty of nations, the international rules-based order. Um, this has taken a wrecking ball to that, in my view. If we do that now, the administration has demonstrated that it's prepared to do all that. That it doesn't feel obligated or bound by the traditional sort of rules-based order. I just think it will hurt the United States in the long run if we do this. If Russia is allowed to profit from its aggression and does not and is not punished. Now, and this is where I hope that the UK and Canada and other countries, and as well as the European Union, would work together to continue the pressure on the Russians. We're very close. I mean, we're very close to crushing the adversary that we have all had to deal with for 8 decades. I mean, we're close to that, and that would improve the security environment of Europe for generations to come. But instead, it feels like we're gonna let them weasel out of this, and after Putin will be another Putin. The Russians only reform after they have been defeated, and that should be our objective.
If we consider the negotiating role that the US has taken, is Trump effectively tying his hands behind his back by potentially having these deals there with Ukraine and Russia over these rare earth minerals? Does it diminish his power?
Whatever, Ukraine is a sovereign country. Russia has no sovereign control. They have de facto control over parts of Ukraine, about 20%, which is amazing. After 11 years of war with every advantage, the Russians have only been able to take about 20% of Ukraine. Uh, but that's not legal sovereign territory of Russia. So I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I would imagine that would not be a valid agreement.
I spoke to a former acting ambassador from the US to the UK, Lewis Lukens, yesterday, and he said to me that when Starmer goes to have this conversation with Trump later, that he shouldn't publicly disagree with Trump, like we saw earlier with Macron earlier this week. I mean, would you agree with that line?
Prime Minister is head of government of a sovereign country, of a great country. And I thought it was so impressive when President Macron, in the Oval Office, corrected the president. And I mean, why would Prime Minister not do the same thing? That's the only way when people are spouting out, false, misleading, wrong information, you have to correct it. I mean, these are two, heads of state or heads of government. And I think I can't imagine. I would never, and who am I to offer advice to your prime minister? But I think the prime minister is tough enough to have made it where he is to know how to handle a situation like that.
I mean, after everything that's been said and done so far by Trump, what does this say about the future of the US's relationship with its European allies?
I do feel like, unfortunately, to the American disadvantage, um, we are losing influence because our moral authority is perceived as being degraded, and it's unfortunate. I don't think that the United States would leave NATO, but the administration has, even more than usual, a U.S. centric focus that we're going to regret. I think in coming years that while sure many European nations took advantage of the United States in different ways, and there's a lot that needs to be addressed, a lot of issues in terms of fair trade, of burden sharing in terms of defense, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, we have benefited more than anybody from this world order that was created after the Second World War. Economically, security, allies, intelligence sharing, on and on and on. The currency, I mean, yes, it's frustrating sometimes, but we have benefited more than anybody. And I think now at some point Europeans are going to realize that they can in fact do a lot more on their own, and that maybe the U.S. is not always going to be seen as the indispensable ally that it once was. And I think we're going to regret this.
You sound quite pessimistic about the future. Do you think that there's anything Trump can do to turn this around, or do you think that he has done permanent damage for the
Well,
rest of
let
his
me
presidency?
say it, look at that differently. This is where Europe. I mean, the president has demonstrated he has no respect for Europe. I mean, he openly talks about. He says the EU was invented to screw the United States. His words. UK obviously is not in the EU anymore, but he sort of lumps together European countries, and I I think that the reason that he felt like he could just start negotiating with the Russians about Ukraine without inviting Ukraine or other European leaders because he has no respect. I mean, in a broad sense, he doesn't respect, and a lot of that is because number one, European countries have not lived up to their obligations for collect contributions to collective security. And also, he genuinely believes that we have been on the wrong end of most of the economic agreements between the United States and European countries. And so, and I think this is sincere. He believes that, fair or not. And so, um, to preserve this relationship, I think Europe also as a whole and as individual European nations need to earn that respect.
Ben Hodges, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you very much for the privilege, Joe.